All right, so Romans. St. Paul writes the epistle to the capital of the empire, but it's really interesting. So St. Paul has a very serious mandate, and that is that he does not permit any apostle to mess with the territory of another apostle, right? So if an apostle founds a church, another apostle is not supposed to go in and meddle. And yet, St. Paul tells us that he did not found the Roman church, and yet he's meddling. So it's not even that he meddles as much as to say how important the content of what he's talking about in this epistle is. And it really becomes, as I said before, Galatians is the foundation really for the gospel of Jesus Christ. So when you hear that word gospel, ultimately it points first and foundationally to his epistle to the Galatians. Galatians is only 6 chapters, and it's like he really felt urgency and he had to get in and get out because there was chaos in the Galatian region, right? And so he was very quick about it. In fact, even in his introduction, I'm Paul, an apostle, boom, and he's right into it. Subsequent epistles, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, the Timothy letters, the Thessalonians, if he wrote both of them, all take their lead from Galatians. Even the Gospel of Mark takes its lead from Galatians. Romans, likewise, takes its lead from the epistle to the Galatians. But it is ultimately, we would use the word St. Paul's summa, his masterpiece, right? It is really the most well explicated and the longest of his letters. Most important, which is why the canon, the scriptures, it's placed right after the Gospels and the book of Acts. So even though it was not written first in history, they put it first in the letters. Does that make sense? So it's very important, the epistle to the Romans. Most of Rome, so we would understand, and this is important, most of the Roman citizens would live, and I'm sure you've seen TV shows on Netflix, as Deacon Green was saying, and all that good stuff. The Roman households were independent, semi-independent units that would have the father and mother of the family. There would be children in the house. Probably there were slaves that would live there and would work, under the leadership of the Roman patricians. Again, in Rome, especially when there was the Senate before the Republic became an empire, there would, all that kind of intrigue that would go on with it as well. And, they would often have these really extravagant parties, right? Where people would come together, and I know you've all heard of, the Roman orgy, but they would also have the feast where they would eat. Even sometimes they would allow themselves to eat so much that they would get sick so that they could, I know it's gross, make room and eat some more, right? Like it was a pretty gross, extravagant lifestyle. The most important figure in the Roman household is someone called the pater familias. Pater familias, the father of the house, right? So he would be the lord of the house. And his wife, if he was married, would be the mater familias, right? And she was maybe not equally as important, but definitely not, equivalent to a slave in the household. The word of the pater familias was law, right? So, it was what he said went. And so he would instruct his children or his slaves, or even sometimes his wife, go do X, Y, or Z, and it was assumed, expected that would be abided by, that commandment, right? All right, so those are some things to keep in the back of our mind. It also appears that as St. Paul was carrying the gospel, his ultimate desire would be to take it all the way to what we now call Spain, that he makes a pit stop on the way to the church in Rome to deliver this letter. Now, some scholars say he never got there, that he died before, and that it was delivered later. Others say that he did get there. Regardless, for us, at least for our study tonight, the point is that this letter would have been delivered and read to the house church in Rome, right? Okay? All right. Let's get after it. If you have a Bible, open it. If not, I'm going to read all the way through, so it's okay. It's good to listen to it, but always hearing it is better. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. There's a lot going on there. First, Paul, a servant. We are Americans, so we, have a colored history, I guess. And so we don't use the word slave, but that's what St. Paul said, right? So he uses the word slave. Now remember this too, and it's important because you have to understand in the context of the Roman Empire, there are no free people. Almost everyone's a slave, right? You have the Roman emperor or, the senators, a few other people that may have been free. There were some that had been set free, but the majority of people were all slaves, right? I mean, they were slaves. That's how it worked in the empire. And Paul is considering himself a slave as well, but a slave of God, a slave of Jesus Christ, right? So he's interesting because Paul, he's one of these, fascinating figures. He's a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, but he's also a free Roman citizen. So he does kind of dabble on both sides of the fence. So he can declare his Roman citizenship when it's convenient, and he also tries most often to make himself, subject to God. And listen to this phrase, an apostle set apart for the gospel of God, right? I'm set apart, right, in order to preach this gospel, which he promised beforehand through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures, right? Now, there's a lot going on there. You might say to yourself, how could he preach the gospel before to the prophets? Because the gospel is about Jesus Christ, but there was no Jesus yet when the prophets were preaching Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the rest, right? What's he talking about, right? What's this gospel he's talking about? It's a fascinating question, right? I think the answer is to say this, and often we may hear people say that God, and have you heard this just very briefly by show of hands? God was very different, mean and angry in the Old Testament, and he's more loving and kind in the New. Have you heard this kind of stuff before? I mean, I'm sure we've heard that, right? And sometimes even you hear other statements where, the message of the Old Testament is very different than the message of the New Testament. One of war versus one of love, right? We often hear things like that. The fallacy of that kind of thinking is that somehow it says that God changed his mind, or that perhaps in the Old Testament God got it wrong and he needed to fix himself, right? Like, that's a funny thing to say. I mean, we're all nodding our heads because, well, of course, it's God, right? I mean, God is perfect, so you would think he wouldn't make a mistake. What's happening here? Ultimately, my statement is this: the message of the Old Testament is no different than the message of the New Testament. The difference is what? It is now directed to a different audience.